What I'm going to do today is to talk about the political economy of regional powers in a shifting international order, and I will particularly focus on the case of Turkey. I would like to start with two short quotations from the same journal, but published in two different dates. The first one is from 2011, from Economist. It says that with its secular democracy, booming economy, and growing international clout, Turkey has become an inspiration for Muslims around the world. I mean, these were the good days. I mean, everybody was very optimistic about the future of Arab Spring. Everybody was thinking that, not everybody, but I mean, overwhelming majority of the commentators were thinking that at least after a long decade of authoritarian resilience, democracy is coming back to Middle East and North Africa, and Turkey, as a model case, would play an important role in this transformation. And to a significant extent, Turkish policymakers were on the same page. I mean, they were also thinking that Turkey could act as a model. But things changed quite quickly, and this is another quote from the same journal in 2014. Until recently, Turkey, a NATO member that is in membership talks with the EU, was hailed as a shining example. But the Justice and Development Party, I mean the party ruling the country over the last 2 decades as a single-party government, has drained the country of its soft power. So this obviously, this is an anecdotal evidence. But I mean it captures the kind of transformation we experienced over the last 2 decades. And to a certain extent, this is the story of emerging powers or regional powers. Because if, for instance, we organized this workshop in 2010, and if you invited me at the time, most probably I would have been talking about how Turkey implemented soft power-driven regional integration policies, how Turkey was acting as a good citizen of international community and becoming a source of inspiration for other emerging countries. But today, as I am going to show in a minute, I'm going to talk about really different things. And we will try to understand what happened in the meantime and why Turkey plunged into a kind of illiberal political path, why Turkey is shifting away from the West, and what kind of economic policies the country is implementing. So these are going to be the main questions I would like to discuss with you. But at the very basic level, my research question, in order to put in a concrete sentence, I will try to understand Turkey's transformation over the last 2 decades within the context of shifts in liberal international order. And I will particularly try to understand what accounts for paradigmatic transformations in Turkish political economy and its foreign policy over the last 2 decades. And I will try to conceptualize this transformation with reference to the shifts in liberal international order, as I mentioned. And this is obviously for the time being an open question. I would really appreciate your feedback in order to understand whether Turkey is an outlier or whether it is a case that reflects the broader trends and broader shifts in global political economy. So this is the question I would like to pose to you and I'd like to discuss with you in comparative perspective. But my main argument, and at the same time my hypothesis for now, is that Turkey is an illustrative case of global shifts in liberal international order that reflect declining transformative power of the West and the rise of illiberal state capitalist models. And in the rest of my presentation, I would like to advance this argument. And in order to do this, this is my outline. In the first part, I would like to sketch out a framework for analysis. I mean, how we can understand the transformations of within international order and emerging powers are being affected by these transformations and responding to them. And in the second part, I would like to focus on the shifts in Turkish political economy and foreign policy paradigm, and I will try to understand the empirical details of this transformation. And obviously there are paradoxes, conflicts, and stalemates, especially when it comes to geopolitical developments. I mean, Turkey currently is struggling a lot, and from an economic point of view as well. The new economic paradigm actually seems to reach its limits, and I'm going to talk about the current paradoxes and stalemates in the final part of my presentation. Let me start with the broader conceptual framework. I mean, as you all know, probably better than me, I mean, shifts in international order is one of the major debates in current international system, right? I mean, we are talking about rise of emerging powers or demise of emerging power, depending on the perspective you are looking at. But I mean, when you look at the broader international relations discussions on the subject matter, we see that broadly two schools of thought emerge. I mean, one school, mainly liberal internationalists, argue that even if United States is in relative decline, liberal international order will survive. I mean, they argue that liberal international order is something different than US hegemony. For instance, Eikenberry argues that emerging powers do not have a motivation to change the existing international system, because China, for instance, as one of the chief beneficiaries of the globalization policies over the last 3 decades, does not have any intention to spoil the party. Actually, they are becoming part of this international order, so they are hardly revisionists. So liberal internationalists are kind of optimistic about the future of liberal international order. I mean, they are most probably putting emphasis on the resilience of institutions, I mean international governance institutions. But some other scholars are not on the same page. I mean, they are suggesting that what we observe today is not a shift to a multipolarity. I mean, we do not only observe the rise of alternative regional powers or alternative potential hegemonic powers, but also we are transitioning to a multi-order world. And by so, actually, multi-order word. By multi-order, they argue that emerging powers or non-Western powers are socializing within the international system. They are not entirely revolutionary actors, that's for sure. They are taking advantage of the existing system. But on the other hand, they are socializing within this system with reference to their own political economy paradigms, cultural and political norms. And this is also the case when it comes to their perspective towards existing international order. So according to these scholars, non-Western great powers are kind of posing a within system challenge. So within that context, rise of alternative powers refer to the emergence of alternative world orders. What strikes me about these debates is that, I mean, they are absolutely very illuminative and pushing the horizons of international relations and international political economy scholarship for sure. But I think they need to be substantiated with reference to in-depth case studies. I mean, how, for instance, middle countries, I mean, middle powers like Turkey or regional powers at the same time, responding to these shifts, whether they are being influenced by non-Western great powers or whether actually they are becoming part of an alternative international order. I mean, that's the question I ask to myself, and I try to understand whether liberal international order is well received in these economies. And I particularly focus on the Turkish case for the time being, but this is part of a broader political economic project, so I would like to discuss other countries with you as well. And I'm going to come to that point in the conclusion of my presentation. But my hunch is that, and my argument is that, in order to understand the shifts in international order, and in order to understand Turkey's significant transformation over the last 2 decades, we need to start our analysis from the shifts in international order. And in that context, I think focusing on the push dynamics on the one hand and pull dynamics on the other might be a useful starting point. And when it comes to push factors, I would like to underline the declining appeal of liberal international order within the advanced industrialized countries. I mean, in the aftermath of the Cold War period, you all know, liberal internationalism has turned out to be one of the key constituents of international affairs, right? I mean, when I talk about liberal international order, I basically refer to 2 main aspects. According to my conceptualization, liberal international order, on the one hand, rests on free market economy, and on the other hand, liberal democracy. And when we look at the post-1990 developments, we see that free market economy expanded worldwide, and liberal democracy also turned out to be an important political system, right? I mean, United States as the hegemonic actor at the time, on the one hand, pushed very hard in order to expand democracies in different parts of the world. I mean, this was the official rhetoric at the time, whether you like it or not, or whether you agree with that or not. Liberal democracies across the world. And this was accompanied by the expansion of free market economy. I mean, the shrinking space for state in the economy to play a market maker role. I mean, the rising role of, or increasing role of independent regulatory institutions, for instance, neoliberal economic policies pursued by states, and on the other hand, pursued by monetary authorities, such as the independence of central banks. And apart from this, with first Washington Consensus and starting from early 2000s with post-Washington Consensus, we saw this trend only increased in different parts. But I think 2008 financial crisis, from this point of view, marks an important turning point in global political economy, because even in the core Western countries, I mean, people started to believe that liberal democracy and free market economy does not work very well. I mean, Central and Eastern European countries are quite illuminating examples from that point of view, because in the heyday of European enlargement process, these countries were very eager to become members of European Union. I mean, their expectations were huge at the time. I mean, they liberalized their markets, pursued neoliberal economic policies, and when it comes to political front, they introduced significant political liberalization reforms in the front of, for instance, human rights, political rights, and civil liberties. So liberal democracy and free market economy turn out to be a key policy paradigm. But with the global financial crisis, we saw that the neoliberal paradigm had significant flaws. And in the advanced countries, especially within European Union, I mean, the governments could not deal with the structural problems associated with neoliberal paradigm. Rather than trying to address, for instance, the flaws in the way in which global finance operates, I mean, the countries or the leaders of the core countries in the advanced countries pushed for austerity policies, and permanent austerity turned out to be a kind of crisis management mechanism. And I mean, people, even in several wealthy countries, started to think that, I mean, this policy paradigm does not work well. So they started to search for alternative paradigms. And it is within that context that illiberal policies or alternative political and economic arrangements made a strong comeback. But this was not the only trend in the post-2008 financial crisis. On the one hand, we see that, I mean, liberal market economy and liberal democracy started to be jeopardized, I mean, started to face significant challenges. But at the same time, we also see a certain set of pull factors operating in different parts of the world. And this is, I think, directly related to the rise of non-Western great powers. And particularly when I say non-Western great powers, I am talking about China and Russia. I mean, Monica, you were the one, right? You mentioned Russia as a great power yesterday. I am completely on the same page with you. I mean, some scholars do not think that Russia is a great power. But from a military point of view, especially if you focus on the Eurasia continent, without taking Russia's, I mean, geopolitical calculations into consideration, it's not possible to talk about the foreign policies of other regional powers. So my inclination is to include Russia as well as a great power. And Russia-China axis in that period also started to become increasingly important. And I think these two countries, on the one hand, they are socializing within the existing international system. That's for sure. They are pragmatic to a certain extent. They are not, for instance, categorically challenging the liberal international order, but they are challenging the system from within. Meaning that while socializing within that system, they pursue an alternative political economy paradigm. I call it state capitalism here, with reference to other scholars in the field, but I mean, this can be called as state-led market economy or other types of explanations. But the idea at the very heart is simple. I mean, during the neoliberal globalization period, state was considered only a kind of regulatory actor. I mean, private actors were prioritized, and state's market-making role was sidelined But state capitalists think that state in the economy should play much more role than this. And when we look at the economic practices, these countries pursue selective globalization strategies. On the one hand, they are eager to internationalize their multinational corporations. They are quite eager to establish export linkages, investment linkages, etc. But while doing this, they establish close cooperation between private and public sector. For instance, we see the significant rise of public-private partnerships in these countries. When it comes to independent regulatory institutions, they have a disdain for this. I mean, state capitalists are not very happy about, for instance, independent central banks. They think that central banks should be responsible for political elites and they should target beyond monetary stability. For instance, improving the employment conditions, caring about financial stability, all these kind of stuff. But in neoliberal paradigm, as we know, central banks had just one duty, which is maintaining price stability. Controlling inflation. Nothing else, nothing beyond that. These are the common parameters about state capitalism when we look at the literature. But I think one point is equally important. That's the political side of the story. If you look at the state capitalism debate, most of them in political economy literature focus on the productivity, whether state-led enterprises are managed in an effective manner, so on and so forth. These are obviously important discussions and advanced our understanding. But on the other hand, as Robert Gilpin long ago mentioned, each and every economic system rests on a political system. So without understanding the political underpinnings of this system, it's not possible to understand why and how markets operate. So from this point of view, with the rise of alternative new developmentalist models, we also see the significant rise of strongman regimes in the emerging countries. And in strongman regimes, actually primacy is put on collective security and national will. As it was the case in liberal international order, the priority was put on individual rights and freedoms. But in state capitalist models, in an increasingly uncertain and hybrid world, we see that strongman regimes are on the rise because these people actually utilize a kind of politics of fear. They put exclusive emphasis on, as I mentioned, collective security, sovereignty of states, and a national will. To a significant extent, they think that, institutional checks and balances, should be sidelined in order to make rapid decisions, in order to catch up with the advanced countries, in order to protect borders, in order to stem flow of migrants. So pluralist democracy, once considered as an important aspect of not only political but also economic development, now sidelined. In state capitalist models, in strongman regimes, emphasis mainly put on efficient decision-making procedures and trying to get rid of all sorts of minorities. I'm going to go into the details about this framework and try to substantiate it with reference to empirical examples when it comes to the Turkish case. But at the broader level, I can suggest that in order to understand the shifts in regional powers, particularly within the context of Turkey, I think we need to focus on push dynamics and pull dynamics at the same time. And by the way, a caveat I think is in order. When we talk about liberal international order, we are in fact talking about a tightly coupled international regime, as some scholars put it. Tightly coupled in the sense that at the time, neoliberal paradigm was kind of a coherent paradigm, whether we like it or not. It was backed by a network of intellectuals. It was to a significant extent institutionalized, right? And it was quite coherent from a paradigmatic point of view. And second, during liberal international, heyday of liberal international order, we also saw international financial institutions acting as a transmitter role. World Bank, IMF, and other international financial institutions supported and advocated neoliberal policies when it comes to emerging countries. In early 2000s, for instance, when, for instance, crisis-ridden emerging countries applied to IMF, the structural adjustment program they got was quite standard, and it was based on a neoliberal paradigm. And finally, the third pillar of the tightly coupled liberal international regime was the US hegemony. I mean, United States emerged as the only hegemonic actor in the aftermath of the Cold War, and United States Treasury and other state institutions supported neoliberal paradigm when it comes to international institutions and when it comes to their relations with emerging countries. So what I'm saying is that liberal international order, at least in the aftermath of the Cold War period, was tightly coupled, supported by a coherent set of ideas, international organizations, and US hegemony. But what we are talking today is a much more fragmented and hybrid policy regime, in the sense that we are not talking about an hegemonic actor here. I mean, China is quite a pragmatic actor as far as we understand. For instance, Chinese policymakers are not ambitiously pushing for an alternative economic development model. They are very much in favor of experimentation, right? Try and error process. And from that point of view, I mean, it's possible to talk about Beijing consensus. I think there's kernel of truth in these discussions, but Beijing consensus is not as coherent as Washington consensus, because United States at the time was supporting Washington consensus in full speed, but this is not the case for China. Not only because Chinese political elites are not eager to do so, because material capabilities of China, at least for the time being, are not enough to develop such a kind of international development regime. And this is also the case when it comes to the ideological coherence of, state capitalism or Beijing consensus, or when it comes to international financial institutions, the existing ones or the newly established international governance institutions. So, but what I am trying to say is that I'm talking about state capitalism, talking about the emergence of a possibly alternative international order, but I think there is a caveat, and we should take this into consideration. This is a kind of hybrid regime. It appears that we have entered into a post-liberal international order, but this order is not as coherent as the previous one. So it's a kind of interregnum period. But within that context, all sorts of contradictions emerged. And I'm going to talk about these contradictions with reference to the Turkish case in the rest of my presentation. So if we look at the last 2 decades in Turkish political economy, I think it's possible to talk about 3 major phases. The first one, compatible with the conceptual framework I sketched out, is the cycle of reform activism. It basically covers the period from 2001 up until 2007. This was the first period of the Justice and Development Party government in Turkey. And at the time, Turkey implemented a set of liberalization reforms in the economic, political, and foreign policy dimensions. So Turkey was acting as a kind of good citizen of its international community. Turkey implemented significant democratization reforms when it comes to civil-military relations, individual rights and freedoms, freedom of speech, etc. Also, Turkish policymakers were quite keen on regional integration policies. And I'm going to talk about this issue in a moment. Real transformation started with 2001 economic crisis, because at the time, Turkish economy plunged into a serious deadlock. And 2001 economic crisis was by far the most significant or deepest economic crisis in the peacetime history of the Republic. So in the aftermath of the crisis, Turkey implemented a neoliberal agenda. Pursued the recommendations of the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and the European Union as well. I'm not going to go into the details, but at the very basic level, privatizations took place, financial system significantly overhauled, and independence of central bank granted. Before that period, central bank was not independent in Turkey. And apart from this, in order to curtail the role of the state in the economy, independent regulatory institutions, along with post-Washington consensus paradigm, was established. And as a result, during this period, especially up until global financial crisis, Turkish economy improved significantly. There's, too much data. Please just focus on the first and second rows, which are much more important for our purposes now. If you look at here, Turkey's GDP in current prices increased from $300 billion to more than $700 billion. just after the global financial crisis. And Turkey GDP per capita in current prices also increased from more than $4,000 to $10,000. In current prices, still that's an impressive improvement. And this economic transformation and political stability at the domestic front also spilled over into foreign policy area. And in this period, Turkey pursued a soft power-driven regional power strategy. And this was absolutely the case up until 2011, when Arab Spring broke out and civil war in Syria changed geopolitical equilibrium in a dramatic manner. But Turkish policymakers in the first phase of the Justice and Development Party, pursued a very integrationist regional integration policy, and it was a kind of functional spillover logic, as we see from European integration and integration attempts elsewhere in the world. The idea was that Turkish policymakers tried to improve bilateral trade and investment relations with Middle East and North African countries, and the expectation was that these economic relations, intensification in economic relations, would also facilitate talking problematic political issues, and perhaps at the end of the day it would lead to a form of political cooperation at the regional level. So Turkish policymakers invested a lot. For instance, signed free trade agreements with Middle Eastern countries, enabled visa-free travel with several countries, and joint Council of Ministers meetings. It's hard to believe now, but at the time, Syria turned out to be one of the most important actors for Turkish policymakers in order to further regional integration attempts. And some scholars, as a result, even called or labeled Turkey as a trading state. This concept has always been problematic from my point of view. That's at least the case. Okay? And when we look at the data, Turkey's trade relations with neighboring region in that period, as a result of the expansion in Turkish economy, we also see expansion in foreign trade. For instance, Turkey's trade with MENA countries, Middle East and North African countries, increased from $5.7 billion to almost $56 billion, which basically means that it increased from 6% to 14% of Turkey's total foreign trade. And this is also the case when it comes to broader Asian region, non-Western region. The share of Asia in Turkey's total trade increased from 15 to 31% in that period. So quite a significant transformation. So at the time, the expectations were really benign. People were quite optimistic about the developments. But I think starting from the global financial crisis and the shifts in international order, Turkey's policies also shifted. And Turkey's regionalization strategy also put into a severe test in that period. I'm not going to go into the details of the period of stagnation because, this is just a period where Turkish policymakers try to understand what was really going on in international system, and at the time there were also significant domestic challenges, and perhaps we can discuss these issues in Q&A session. Now I would like to focus on the second episode in the regionalization strategy of Justice and Development Party, and I will try to understand what happened in Turkey and why happened at all. Obviously, at the heart of the story is the rising tide of illiberalism at home in the post-1911 period. If you look at this data, this is from Freedom House. One means the best. If you are a proper liberal democracy, the score you get from Freedom House is 1. If you are a completely authoritarian regime, the score you get is 7. And when you look at Turkey's Freedom House scores, in the first period, we see important improvements. It decreased from 4.5 to 3. And then, in a gradual manner, it started to increase, and now Turkey is not considered as a free country. Actually, it's considered as a not free country according to Freedom House. It's quite. This is for Russia, by the way. I'm going to talk about the political rapprochement between Russia and Turkey in that period as well. But what we observe in the last decade is the increasing tide of illiberalism in Turkey. And this is very much related to the rise of Justice and Development Party as a hegemonic party in Turkish politics. Here, you will see the vote shares of Justice and Development Party. It started with 34% of total votes. And in a gradual manner, Justice and Development Party managed to increase its vote shares. And this is a unique development in Turkish political history, because for the first time a political party in Turkish political history managed to form single-party governments 3 times consecutively by increasing its vote shares. And as a result, following the 2011 elections, Justice and Development Party turned out to be a kind of hegemonic party in Turkish politics. Significant transformations started to take place when it comes to institutional checks and balances, freedom of expression, rule of law, etc. But these transformations at the domestic level went hand in hand with global transformations. For instance, starting from 2010, in line with the transformations in international order, we see that Turkish policymakers also started to subscribe to a new policy paradigm. State-led development model or new developmentalist ideas became much more important in the policy-making agenda of Turkish ruling elite. For instance, as I mentioned, in the previous decade, neoliberal policies or post-Washington consensus constituted the main pillars or main institutional framework within which Turkish economy was operating at the time. The striking point is that the same political elites started to develop an alternative framework, and this framework, to a broader extent, I will argue, is compatible with state capitalist models. For instance, in that period, we see the hands-on approach developed by the state. For instance, Turkey designed an industrial strategy policy and started to invest in mega projects, bridges, airports, railways, all these sorts of stuff, and public-private partnerships turn out to be quite an important investment strategy. For instance, according to a recent World Bank report, Turkey invested more than $143 billion in public-private partnerships. This means that Turkey is the 4th largest investor in public-private partnerships after China, Brazil, and India. These countries have large economies, right? Turkey is not, that powerful when it comes to economic size. But in terms of public-private partnerships, the scale of investments in Turkey are really huge. And when we look at the speeches or op-eds of the key policymakers in Turkey, we see that, state capitalism kind of makes its way into Turkish political economy as well. I would like to read you 2 short quotations from the advisors of the president. For instance, one of the advisors to the president declared the new Asian era in global political economy in that period, and suggested that economic orthodoxy is exploitive and enslaving, and also argued that liberal economic and political integration policies have bankrupted. The same person, advisor, praised China as a successful model of development and promoted states' active involvement in economy without completely ruling out the private sector. So we are talking about a new economic paradigm here. And another advisor to the president argued that world economy is moving to the east, and Turkey-Russia line will be one of the new economic power centers of the new world equation. I can bring several other examples as well, but what we observe in this period is a kind of new political economic paradigm in the making. And I think state capitalism is the right term to use here. And this comes with obviously increasing material linkages with Russia-China axis. When we look at trade relations, when we look at Russian and Chinese investments in Turkey, we see that these actors are becoming increasingly important in Turkish political economy. I'm not going to go into the details because I'm running my time, but I think S-400 missiles issue is quite an important one with huge security implications. Turkey is a NATO member, and S-400 missiles are produced by Russians. NATO members are not happy that Turkey wanted to purchase S-400 missiles from Russia. But Turkish authorities, apparently they are not on the same page with their NATO members, especially with the United States. But at the end of the day, they purchased S-400 missiles from Russia. And this is a very peculiar situation because for the first time in history, to my knowledge, a NATO member purchased S-400 missiles from a non-NATO country. And S-400 missiles, I'm not an expert in defense policies, my colleagues working on defense say that, it's a very powerful weapon. And United States criticized significantly. So this is a significant transformation. And when it comes to Belt Road Initiative, Turkey is quite eager to take part in this initiative. And for instance, for the first time in history, Turkish officials received a 3.6 billion loan package from China. Again, this is not a huge number. 3.6 billion does not make much sense per se. But the thing is that Turkey received this loan in the middle of the conflict with the United States in late 2018. At the time, Turkey had an issue with the United States, and everybody was talking about a possible economic crisis in Turkey because Turkish lira was in free fall. Everybody was talking that Turkey is going to apply for the IMF in order to get extra funding. But this didn't turn out to be the case. Rather than going to IMF, because the president has been criticizing IMF for quite a long time period, Turkish authorities preferred to go to the Chinese and receive their loan. And not the amount, I think the timing and the symbolic message it conveyed was quite critical at the time. So I can bring further examples, and in the institutional field as well, Turkey is now eager to become part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Some people think that Turkey is using this as a kind of bargaining chip in order to increase its leverage vis-a-vis the United States and European Union in particular. But I am not on the same page. I will say that Turkish president has a kind of genuine interest in becoming part of BRICS organization. And last year in the BRICS meeting, he even offered an alternative name. He said that if you make us a member, we can change the name as BRICS. Turkey can become part of the institution. At the end of the day, when we look at the past 2 decades in Turkish political economy, we see significant transformation. The first decade was a period when Turkey was considered as a good citizen of international community, was broadly acting within the liberal internationalist framework. But starting from 2010 onwards, significant transformation took place. I didn't talk about the collapse of state structures in the Middle East with the Arab Spring and the geopolitical risks it created. But this was also part of the global hegemonic transformations, I will say. The thing is that in order to understand Turkey's transformation, we need to look at transformations at the global level. But obviously this gives us broader trends. This does not explain everything, does not offer a very solid causal story. In order to understand this, for sure we need to put Turkey in a comparative perspective and compare the country with other emerging powers. And from that point of view, Brazil is a very striking example because their ways seem to diverge. In Brazil, the current president is trying to develop relations with the United States, but in Turkey, Turkey is trying to open more policy space to itself and trying to act in a strategically autonomous manner and trying to improve its relations with non-Western great powers. And also, when we look at other countries, we see, diverging trends. Then the question is, what accounts for this difference? If we have these kind of global transformations, then what are the domestic intermediating factors that leads to diverging patterns in emerging economies? Is this because of the actor preferences? Should we focus on the agency level dynamics? Is this because of domestic institutions or predominant ideology of the policymakers? What accounts for this diversion? This is an open question for me, and I think an excellent idea for a comparative research. But my argument is that the question is not whether shifts in international order are informing the transformation in emerging powers. I think that's absolutely the case. The question is how and to what extent. What other factors should be taken into consideration in order to make sense of what is going on in global political economy. Thank you very much.